Okay, as everyone's joining us this morning, we're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome, good morning. Welcome to this Autism Training and Technical Assistance Project monthly webinar. Today's topic is Autism University, Lessons from Beyond the Classroom, and we are joined once again by our presenter, Hayley Moss. So we are excited to welcome her back this morning. Couple of housekeeping items before we get started. Just as a reminder, all participants on this webinar are in listen-only mode, and you cannot unmute yourselves since we are on the webinar platform. So if you have questions as the session proceeds, please post those in the chat or the Q&A, and then we'll address those at the end of the session. And then just as a reminder, this session is being recorded and will be posted on our Autism Training and Technical Assistance Project website within 48 hours, and we will post that link in the chat here momentarily. And then in an effort to be as accessible as possible, this session is offering live closed captioning, which you can turn on using your toolbar on your Zoom toolbar. It should say live transcript, and you should be able to enable that. And then at the end of today's session and tomorrow, each attendee will receive a follow-up email, and that follow-up email will include the link with all of the information to our website, today's recording, and then a follow-up survey as well. So we would greatly appreciate it if you can take 5 minutes out of your workday and provide us with professional development feedback from today's session or any of our previous sessions, or help improve any upcoming sessions. So any feedback we definitely welcome. And then just a reminder, if you do have faulty internet connection today and you prefer to call in, you can do so by using the phone number in your original registration email, and I'll put that phone number in the chat momentarily as well. And then Hayley, if you could go to the next slide for me, we just want to briefly introduce you to the Autism Training and Technical Assistance Project and kind of who we are and what we do. So the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support, we work on the Autism Training and Technical Assistance Project, and we develop and present resources that assist individuals with autism in their transition from secondary to post-secondary and employment. And so we do these monthly webinars to provide training and support to important stakeholders such as yourselves, and to provide an equitable experience for individuals on the spectrum. You can go to the next slide, please, Hayley. And then a little bit about us at ICSPS. So we create, support, and deliver professional development for education professionals across the state. And we provide technical assistance, develop publications, facilitate programs to improve strategies. And we focus mostly on college transition, recruitment, retention, and completion. We were founded in 1977, so we've been around for quite some time. And we are housed at Illinois State University in Bloomington Normal in the Educational Administrations and Foundations Department within the College of Education. So that is quite a mouthful, as you can imagine. Go to the next slide, please, Hayley. And we're going to start off today. This is the website that you can actually follow along and click on the link once we get the slide deck to you here in a second. And then if you go to the next slide, please, Hayley. We're going to start off with our beginning poll. So I'm going to go ahead and launch those for you today. So the first one is, which region are you located in? And if you scroll down, which ADA stakeholder do you best represent? And you can actually select multiple of those. So if you are a student in post-secondary or secondary, or if you are a family member and a community member, you have the opportunity to select those in multiple choice. So we'll give everyone about a couple minutes here to answer these beginning polls. And I also did want to mention that this project is in coordination with the Illinois State Board of Education as well. So kind of as these polls are coming in and you all are answering them, I'm gonna kind of debrief on them as well. So we have quite a few of you joining us from up north, Chicago area. So welcome this morning. And the rest of you really scanned across the board. I know me and my colleagues are joining you from Central Illinois, and Hayley is joining us from Florida this morning. And then which ADA stakeholder do you best represent? We have a lot of students, young adults, post-secondary and secondary joining us this morning. So I'm going to end that poll and share the results, and you guys can kind of see what I was debriefing us here about. And then I'm going to introduce you to our presenter today, Hayley Moss, and she's going to take us away.
Hello, everyone. And it looks like we have such an interesting collection of folks who are involved. So we have people who are involved with the secondary system, we have post-secondary folks, and we have a lot of students and young adults joining us today. So welcome to all of you. It is an absolute pleasure to get to be with you all again. So if you don't know me, and if you haven't been with me before in an ADA webinar, my name is Hayley Moss. You can probably see me side by side with the PowerPoint, but there's a picture of me on the slide nonetheless. I am autistic. I am an attorney. I am the author of several books, and I'm also an artist and an advocate. If you want to stay in touch with me after our presentation, or you have questions or concerns or feelings that you would like to share outside of this public forum, you can always send me an email or say hello to me on social media. A little bit of housekeeping really before we get started. I'm really glad that Kirsten gave us a little bit of an overview of what we're talking about today. So we're talking about college and kind of that beyond type thing. I realized that somehow I started college nearly 10 years ago, which is kind of wild to think about. And now I actually am in the wonderful position of getting to adjunct and teach at the college level. So my entire perspective from student to professional and graduate student to actually teaching has been quite a journey. And I think it's really exciting to get to have this conversation, and hopefully we keep it a little light, a little fun. I know that we're coming up to the holidays or are in the middle of holidays or just celebrated our holidays, depending on what culture you're from or how you view December. So whatever holidays that you are experiencing, or no matter how you feel, I hope that this period gives you a little bit of rest. I hope it gives you some renewal, some peace, and a little bit of everything in between. So this is our last webinar together for 2021. And just because I know a lot of us are new, you know that we have closed captions, we have all sorts of accessibility features, the slides will be provided to you. And just because I know that some of you may be new to me, I want to kick us off with a really quick overview. And if you're not new to me, this should be a quick refresher. Is we talk a lot about neurodiversity in our webinars together. And in case this might be something that's new to you, and this was definitely new to me when I was in college, which is especially why it feels really relevant right now, is when we're talking about neurodiversity, altogether, we're talking about this idea and concept where we all have different brains, and that's a good thing. So we should be seeing the fact that our brains work different from one another's as completely normal and as part of human variation. Just like how we all have different skin colors and eye colors, and we're from different parts of the world, and some of us are tall, some of us are short, all sorts of things that make us human. And neurodiversity is also one of those things that make us human. So I think it's really exciting to get to discuss this really briefly with everyone as well. And when we think about neurodiversity and how our brains work, we're thinking about how we process information. We're thinking about how we experience sensory things. We're thinking about how we work and how our brains operate. We're not necessarily thinking about differences in opinions or thought process. Like, I'm not talking about political ideologies or diversity of thought. We're talking about how our brains work, how we experience the world around us. And whether you're neurotypical and your brain acts in ways that you are expecting or that are considered normal, or you're neurodivergent and your brain works outside of what's expected. And we're thinking about people who are neurodivergent, and this is something you're going to hear me say throughout today, is when we're talking about neurodiversity, we're talking about not just autism, although neurodiversity really did originate within the autistic community. We're also talking about our friends and comrades who have ADHD, learning disabilities, Tourette syndrome, intellectual disabilities, psychiatric and mental health conditions, and also acquired cognitive disabilities. So this is a really broad view and a lot of people. And I also want to make sure we're talking about this fully aware that a lot of our autistic colleagues, friends, or maybe even you might have more than one form of neurodivergence. So there are a lot of people here who might be autistic and also have a diagnosis of ADHD, or you might have autism and also have an intellectual disability, or you may also struggle with your mental health. So there's so many ways of thinking, communicating, and being. And you might not just fit neatly into one little box. And that is totally normal. And when we think about who is neurodivergent, this turns out to be about 1 in 7 human beings. That's a lot of people. It really does check out when we think about how, when it comes to disability more broadly, under the CDC, about 1 in 4 Americans has a disability. And we also got those new numbers about how 1 in 44 people will be identified as having an autism spectrum condition. So we have a lot of people who are neurodivergent and whose brains work differently. And that really does inform our conversation, whether it's about college, whether it's about work, and all the different self-advocacy conversations and whatnot that we've had together in this space. But it is going to inform how we talk about college and transitioning to adulthood as well. And I want to start us off by talking about when autistic people graduate from high school. And when we're talking about graduating from high school, we have to remember that not everyone graduates that traditional linear path of they finish with the 8th grade. Maybe you got a GED. Maybe you also were part of a certificate program or a post-high school type program related to your IEP. So you might have been learning life skills up until you turned 21 or 22 under the law or your IEP. But for a lot of people who graduate high school on the spectrum, there's a lot of different options that seem to happen. And this really is a lot to think about for us. So we have folks who continue their education. We have folks who enter employment. We have a small percentage that live independently and apart from their parents. We have different social and community participation. We have this access to services gap. And we also are thinking about our health and safety and co-occurring conditions, as well as things like who's attending college, who had a job right after high school or for pay, and also what kind of services someone's receiving, and also things like bullying during high school. And kind of touching back on that co-occurring conditions, which is 60% of adolescents on the spectrum had 2 or more additional health or mental health conditions. That really does go back to why we talked about neurodiversity to kick us off too. So when we think about this, and I think about my own experiences, I think about that I did attend post-secondary and college education. I went to a 4-year college right after high school, but I had never held a job. This was the very first time I would be living independently and apart from my parents. I wanted to be involved in my community. I was going to have a roommate. I remember not knowing how to access services and registering with my college disability services, just not knowing what I would be needing. So when we think about this, there's really a lot that goes into this post-high school world. And especially for autistic people who don't get that real world experience, so to speak. So we don't have maybe experience being away from home. So maybe you never went to sleepover socially. Maybe you never went to camp, which is something that I didn't do and something that really stood out amongst my other neurotypical peers. I had never been away from home. I didn't even stay with my grandparents or other family members. I had never been on a plane by myself until I was 21. So it was a huge adjustment moving out and going to college. So think about all of these things that we're doing when we prepare for these transitions. And when we talk about transition, I want us to think about transition in 2 different camps. I want us to think about big transitions and small transitions. So when we think about big transitions, like the big ones, think about things that are really major, no matter who you are. Moving, starting a new job, a new child, a new family member, a pet, the death of somebody that you love and care about, or also those small transitions, like leaving your house to go to work or changing your clothes, or maybe there is a new addition to your schedule. So maybe you're starting a new routine, like working out every other day or something like that. So these new schedules and routines have big and small transitions, or even, and especially for our autistic young people who might be registering for services or receiving new services, or their providers may change. I think about this a lot because once you hit adulthood, your providers do change pretty rapidly. So maybe when you turn 18, you might no longer be seeing a pediatrician. Maybe you're moving and you have to find new doctors. Maybe you have to find new disability support systems, all sorts of different things. So we have these big and small transitions. And for autistic people, they could be particularly overwhelming because a lot of us do thrive on knowing what's to come, having clear expectations, and just we get comfortable and take comfort in the things that we already know and love. So this can be huge to think about with what happens next. But I do want to think about college in particular, since we are talking about universities and colleges today. And when we're thinking about post-secondary education, things have been improving for students and young people on the spectrum. So more than 44% of students with autism are receiving some type of post-secondary education in the US. So about a third of them are going to a college, and others are attending non-degree seeking programs. So they might be doing one of those types of programs that's offered by a university to have that immersive experience. There's all sorts of things like the college internship program, which does give young people on the spectrum this live away from home and practice attending classes or job training. We also see these non-degree programs such as our vocational programs. There's a lot of other options that folks do that might not be a 2 or 4 year college or university. And when we do think about who's going to college, we also have to think about who's graduating as well. So fewer than 20% are graduating 5 years after high school. And that was from a research study from Drexel. And when we think about why autistic students aren't graduating, we have to immediately get out of our heads that it's this ableist idea that we're just not cut out for it. There are many reasons that students do not finish college, especially if you're autistic. It might be related to not receiving services, a lack of accommodation, a lack of support, finances. There's so much that really does go into this equation that we have to be mindful of that, of what kind of barriers to access do autistic students face, and how can we best prepare them to either face these barriers, or how do we best prepare them to have to knock these walls and barriers down. And I think about that a lot with college. So I was very overwhelmed for a long time with living away from home, setting new routines, but my problems and difficulties in college were not academic. And it's very easy to just straight up assume that the issues with graduation in particular are academic, when really that could be a very small portion of why students are either dropping out, transferring, or going on to do something else completely. Not everybody who does not finish is going to do the Mark Zuckerberg and essentially drop out to start a new company or something else because they decide that's the reason to not finish or graduate from college. So I think it's really important that we're realistic and think about why there is this big disparity compared to the neurotypical and general public and population. And all of that should be informing how we best prepare people as they embark on this journey to college and university, whether it's at a 2 or 4 year institution. And a lot of that ultimately boils down to these ideas of independence and what we consider being a young adult and adulthood. So we hear this idea of how you have to be independent. We talk a lot about being an adult. We talk a lot about independent living skills. And these are things that really are difficult, especially if you didn't have experience with them at home or before you get to college, whether it's through an immersive program, whether it's through certain provisions in an IEP, all sorts of different things. That all this was stuff that I didn't have that much real world experience with. And it made getting to college extremely difficult. So think about what we learn about surviving as an adult that's completely unrelated to whatever it is that we're studying or learning in school. And I lived on campus when I was in college. I moved into the dorms. I wanted the most traditional college experience you can ever ask for because I didn't want to be seen as different. And that's something I want to unpack for everybody a little bit later today too. But I had a roommate, as is a rite of passage of many people who have a college roommate. It did not go very well. And when I did move into the dorms and into this tiny little space, unrelated to majoring in psychology and criminal justice, I learned how to live away from my parents and learn how to do things on my own. I learned how to have a roommate and manage that conflict, that confusion, that boundary, all that stuff. I learned how to manage money very basically. So I know when it comes to teaching money management, this is something that a lot of providers will tell me that they struggle with autistic people. I might have learned how to have a debit card and bank accounts and how to manage that and do deposits, and also to be able to balance a budget, to some extent. And also when it was okay to say, use a credit card, even though right now at this point in my life, I have a very different take on how to manage finances, especially once you're paid and you have a job as well. And I know that many college students may also be working at the same time. So this might be a little bit more complicated to manage, but knowing the basics is pretty good. Knowing how to get around on our own. So I am someone who did not have a car when I was in college. I didn't feel comfortable driving up to somewhere 4 hours away and having to deal with parking at the university and applying for permits and other students who might not be very good drivers for many different reasons. I learned how to use the public transportation and bus system. I learned how to make friends. I learned how far and reasonable it would be to walk places, maybe if I needed a bike, all sorts of different things. I got really, really creative when I was in college about getting around town, and not just on campus as well. And also knowing my way around campus, because when I went to University of Florida, which is a huge state school down here, if you've seen the football stadium on TV during Saturdays, you know that it holds like 90,000 people, and campus is just large, to say the least. So I think that's something that kind of is interesting when we think about how do we get around this large place in a new city or a new town. And especially if you don't bring a car for whatever the reason, or if you are someone who is living at home while at a four-year institution, maybe you're going to end up learning something like how to set those boundaries to get around on your own and also be on your schedule rather than your family schedule. I also learned how to do laundry. So I knew how to do laundry at home, and I tell this story a lot actually, but the first time that I did laundry when I got to college, I ended up putting everything into the dryer first. So the washer dryers at UF, or at least the dorm that I lived in, were stacked, kind of like the picture that you can see on the screen, that they were stacked, but one was the washer and one was the dryer. And my washer dryer at home was not stacked. So I just assumed the one on the left was the washer, the one on the right was the dryer. And I was very wrong. I put everything into the dryer. It came out all sudsy and warm rather than wet. And it was pretty embarrassing for me. And I thought that I was just such a failure at being independent and being an adult, because we have this idea of independence, and we're going to talk about this too. But this idea of independence being that for people with disabilities and autistic people in particular, we think of independence is having to do everything by yourself and that you don't need assistance. And what I ended up learning in that moment and throughout my life at this point, again, it's been almost 10 years now, is how independence is not doing everything yourself. Independence also means some of these other things that I learned, like admitting if something is too much and you need assistance, and also being better at advocating for yourself and your own needs. Some of these things I still kind of struggle with a little bit, and that's okay. Again, learning and growing and adulthood is a huge journey for anybody, especially when you're autistic, and some of these things are difficult because of your disability and your neurology, and it's not a moral failing. I think that it's very quick for people to assume that, oh, you can't do laundry, why are you so dumb? Or they think it's just like a moral failing of sort when you're not able to do things, or that you struggle with certain things. But what we're going to learn is that's not really true, is that sometimes your brain just works against you, or you get overwhelmed, or it's anxiety inducing, or it's a sensory issue, that we have to be empathetic to how we talk about these things and realize that teaching the skills to ask for help, to advocate for ourselves, and to set boundaries are actually forms of independence that we should be celebrating. There are things that I do not know how to do on my own, and I probably never will. That's not saying that I'm being negative. That's saying that I'm being realistic, and knowing how to ask for help in those situations is really empowering. And I did live alone. So on the screen, you can see a nice little picture of my freshman dorm, or at least my half of the room. The other half belonged to the roommate that we talked about. And I always say, when you're living on your own, whether it's yourself or in a new city or anywhere, some of the easiest things to teach in our little world for autistic young people, especially if they're staying at campus or near campus, knowing things like where your nearest pharmacy is, especially because I know a lot of people who are autistic do have additional medical or mental health needs. They might need to pick up a prescription, they might need to fill a prescription, or maybe there's an emergency and they need to do something like pick up headache medication, or even just emergency provisions, because as we know, most pharmacies or pharmacy like chains like CVS might be open 24/7, and sometimes it's the best thing when you are in need of any supplies in an emergency. Something that is also good to know, especially for our picky eaters or those with food sensitivities or that are on a limited diet, is even knowing about restaurants and food delivery. I know if we're on college campuses, a lot of us might not be thinking about this. We might be thinking about what the dining hall offers, but I am also being honest and understand that the dining hall might be very difficult for many other reasons. I found the dining hall to be very overwhelming. It was always very loud. It was always very crowded. And there was always certain food options that there's a very good chance that I wouldn't eat. So before I swiped the card through there, I probably was thinking about what can I get delivered, or is there something else on campus that I'd rather have instead? My campus had fast food restaurants on campus, so all in major like buildings. We had all the major chains. It was extremely cool. And also, I know as when we talk about delivery, when I was in college, everything was all about ordering a pizza. But now with the advent of different delivery apps and programs, you can get all sorts of different things sent to you. So whether it's cooking supplies from somewhere like a HelloFresh, or you are someone who wants to order, say, from any restaurant in town, I'm sure you can get that through a DoorDash, an Uber, or any other service available to you. So it is a lot easier and at your fingertips and requires a lot less talking on the phone than it did 10 years ago. So that's actually pretty exciting, but it's a really good skill to know because as we know, sometimes with executive functioning or late night studying, you might not know where to budget that time for food in or something of that nature. So anything that helps kind of hack our executive functioning or to help make things a little bit easier for our autistic young people living on their own is great. You should also know how to clean up after yourself. So try not to leave your space too messy. Try to be a little bit organized if you can. I know it's really difficult. I am a human tornado a lot of the time, but my general rule is don't be dirty. I understand if you have mess. I understand if you have clothes. I understand if you're like me and you have a throw blanket on your chair like I did. But then again, I had a throw blanket there because the chair was not attractive. But if you are someone who is messy, control your mess, especially if you live with another person. And anything to avoid dirt is always great. Or dirt, grime, mold, all of those things. So know how to clean like your bathrooms, know how to clean anything that gets dusty or dirty, anything of that nature to help make your life and your roommate or other people you live with lives easier. Knowing how to do laundry and not of having the mishap that I did with not knowing which one was the washer and which one was the dryer is always a great step in the right direction. When you live on campus or you're at a college campus, knowing where the bookstore is always something I recommend. So whether you're buying textbooks, you want some cool university branded swag, or if you also do need some of those emergency provisions are sometimes there. I always tell people know where the nearest mall is. And usually people look at me funny because I know that the internet is instant gratification and you can get anything you want pretty much delivered to your doorstep. I always tell people knowing where the mall is a great thing because if you need somewhere to maybe spend a day, if you want to be around other people, if you do have to do some last minute shopping, if you realize you need something, but you're not sure what, or you want to bring gifts home, all sorts of things, that's great. And also it's another way to get to hang out with other people if that's something that you want to do and on your terms, of course. If you have a car, please know where you can park. So if you live in an apartment building, maybe know if there's like resident parking. If you live on campus, when I did not have a car, but it was stratified by how many credit hours you had as to where you can park based on the parking permit that you had, which was assigned based on how many credits you had. If I did have a car, I would have had amazing parking situations because of my credit hours, especially because I transferred credit. Also know how to use things like public transportation. So if that's something that's relevant to you, especially if you don't have a car, knowing how to safely navigate around where you live is really important. I was a huge fan of public transportation, still am, not because you're a friend to the environment, but because it gave me a semblance of independence of not having to rely on other folks for rides all the time. So I would take the bus because the city that my college was in had a really wonderful bus system. Now that I live in sunny Miami, Florida, I am intimately familiar with the metro system on that nice straight line that takes you nicely into downtown in 15 minutes or less as compared to the horrendous traffic of living in a big city. As I'm sure those of you from the Chicago area can probably relate because we all know that city traffic is absolutely horrendous. And finally, and probably not, if not most importantly, have your list of emergency contacts of people you would contact in an emergency or someone like a roommate or a trusted friend can contact in an emergency on your behalf. So maybe this is knowing something like having 911 saved. Maybe this is your parents. Maybe this is a sibling. Maybe this is a partner. Maybe this is a mental health professional that we have our list of emergency people. And I would save this both on your phone and also have it handy just in case of an emergency as well. So I know it's very easy not to know people's phone numbers in this day and age, but sometimes you might need to know that information. And also just so you can provide it if you need anything as well. So I know when you sign waivers for activities or you go to the student healthcare clinic. This is all stuff that you have to be thinking about and knowing. And I know it sounds very kind of nitty gritty, but I really wanted to mention all of these things as kind of your crash course. And this, some of these things alone is just enough to know how to survive and not go completely like stir crazy from being at home all the time. I also want to talk about executive functioning. And executive functioning, at least for me, proved to be one of the most difficult things in college and my adult life. And if you haven't heard of this before, no worries, we're going to define it really quickly for you. Is that executive functioning and also self-regulation skills are mental processes that enable us to plan, focus our attention, remember instructions, and also prioritize and juggle different tasks. So this is like our brain's control system, like right up there. And this is something that a lot of neurodivergent people do struggle with. So people on the spectrum struggle with this, people who have ADHD, especially if you have both, you probably struggle with this. This is also a struggle that might be common with other cognitive disabilities as well. And it really shows during the transition to adulthood and college because there aren't those handy reminders or nagging parents or other caregivers to really kind of drive the train, so to speak, when it comes to executive functioning. Is you're like, oh my gosh, I have to actually be able to balance my schedule and my calendar and study and do this and what's most important. And I want to make friends. And you're just like, oh my gosh, look at all this stuff going on. And here's kind of a nice little visual of what that might look like, especially for college students, is they're thinking, how do I balance everything? And whether it's school and life and stopping and starting things. So we think about how people are balancing things like studying and going to class and books and finals and roommates and our freedom, and maybe we have a job outside or an internship and a social life, and when do we see our family? I know some people come back to university settings and they have families of their own and children, and they're thinking about budgeting. Is when you look at this takes a lot of prioritization, planning, and executive functioning, and that could be really difficult. So whether it's preparing for meals or whether it's preparing for studying and homework and assignments and midterms or finals, this can be absolutely exhausting and lead to burnout and also other issues for our autistic students as well. So again, this kind of goes back to when we think about issues that autistic students are facing in the course of college and throughout graduation, and questions about how we can support them. This is one of the easiest and probably most pressing ways to be supporting our college students on the spectrum. Which brings me to how we can help support that when we get to the classroom settings. So I am at the point in my life where I am both a former student at the undergraduate and law school level, and now I teach undergraduates. So I teach in the psychology department at Taylor University in Indiana. Yes, I am in Miami. I teach over Zoom. I think it is extremely cool having Zoom class 2 days a week. I personally enjoy it. And some of the things that I've learned from being on the teaching side and also being on the student side are really fascinating. So I know we always talk about what's on the syllabus as kind of that guideline for a lot of students. And something else I think about is how can we make that accessible? And when we think about making it accessible, what's expected of folks, that's something that we're able to do and something we're also able to advocate for as well. So something that I do in making my syllabus as accessible as possible, and something that I wish other professors would do, is at the end of every single course syllabus, you end up seeing this statement about, if you are a person with a disability, please contact the Student Resource Center or whoever handles disability affairs. And rather than having that conversation with the professors, since some professors are not always great about granting accommodations. But for me, I don't use disability as a statement at the end. I have a charter that I actually adapted from a PhD student at the University of Wisconsin. And what that access charter really gets to the heart of is that access is something that we create together. And I know if you've taken previous webinars with me or have been here before, we will talk about access and how one person doesn't gatekeep it. A lot of that was adapted from this PhD student who's a dear friend of mine. And I use that kind of to set the tone on access here. And I use it with my class as well. So they know that we're creating a supportive environment together. I am not there to gatekeep whether or not they eat or drink in class if it's not distracting to other people or myself, because I understand that maybe you need that spike in blood sugar to focus, or you're a diabetic. There's so many things that I can't control for. And I also know if we set that as the tone of this is okay, it doesn't make it that that person feels that they have to disclose or do something other as well. But one thing that really comes up is this idea of accommodations. So when we think about academic accommodations, what a lot of folks don't realize is that we're able to grant them a lot. We're not necessarily altering the course content or making a class easier. Sometimes an accommodation might be having a note taker. It might be extra time on a test. It might be taking that exam in a quiet space. That all these things do not substantially alter or modify the course itself or its content. So when professors think that they can't grant accommodations, they're usually wrong because they think that they're just going to give someone the easy way out. I also am a huge fan of visual and auditory information for students. We have people who learn and process information in different ways. And that does not just apply to autistic students, but to all of us as a neurodiverse society, is that we all have different ways that we process information and communicate. So I like to be as visual and auditory as possible. You know that I tell stories, but all the major bullet points usually are on the slides. I do this with my students as well. And if I can, when I'm with students, or I think that it will add to this conversation, I might bold or color code things that they should think of as really important. Because that way, if they're visual learners, they understand, and if they are auditory learners, they'll hear me maybe repeat it or maybe put some emphasis on that really important thing. So there's different ways that we're able to be universally inclusive, and also just understanding that we do present information in different ways for different learners. This is especially easy for those of us who are taking classes online or are presenting and teaching online. So something that I try to do when I teach now is I try to give a mix of different content. So when I teach students, I try to give them some videos, I try to give them some reading, I try to give them something like a podcast maybe, so they have some auditory. But if I give them an auditory option or a video, I make sure it also has a transcript for those who need to read it rather than view it or to listen to it. I make sure that the information is presented in different ways. And that way it keeps it interesting for me, it keeps it interesting for them. And that depending on how you learn, you're still able to engage with whatever material there is. I think that's something that I've learned works really well. And I know that a lot of, especially when I was in law school, we didn't get any visuals when we were in class. Everything was just talking, and maybe one or two words written on the board. It didn't look at all like our picture with all sorts of mathematical theories and all sorts of writing and scribbles all over the board. We had pretty much none of that. And we just all would go around and try to share things and also argue different points and understand why the law was the way it was, and to learn how to think like a lawyer. But that doesn't necessarily help everybody. So it's really important, especially for all of us, whether we're students or we're faculty or we work with faculty, is communication. So when we're thinking about how we advocate for our accommodations, that's really important. I know as a professor, sometimes it's really difficult to communicate important information. So sometimes our expectations are laid out early on, that we don't expect academic dishonesty, that we expect a certain level of decorum in the classroom. We have all the major deadlines spelled out. I know, at least for me as well, when I do have major deadlines for students, I try to make sure that I send them reminders or to send a Google Calendar to say like, hey, this project is due on XYZ date. But sometimes it's hard to be clear. And if they ask me to clarify things, I try not to brush it off, because I realized maybe I wasn't as clear as I should have been, or I could have been. And it's up to me to do better about that. So it's really important that we understand and lead this with empathy, especially because when I know what's expected of me and what those deadlines are, I'm able to help my own executive functioning and prioritize what's going on in class. It's not fun to be left in the dark. And I know that for faculty especially, and people who do work in post-secondary, there's such a variation in what things look like. So I've had professors and teachers that are extremely accessible and accommodating and approachable, and others who are not. And I know especially there's a lot less uniformity amongst adjuncts like I am. So I don't give a lot of homework. I don't have access to e-learning platforms like a Canvas or a Blackboard or Schoology or whatever they're called now. So that's also really part of what makes it difficult, because students often ask me like, did I submit all the work? Because the only system that I have to work through submissions is Dropbox. And that's just because the university didn't give me access to other software. So that is just what I use personally. And I had to kind of make do with what I have and figure out how to make sure that students know that I have everything that they've submitted, and communicate that clearly to them too. Which brings us to this idea kind of to really bring everything home today, other than talking about social stuff at the end, we're going to talk about self-advocacy, a perfect bridge between what we learn in class and also how we survive and communicate and explore the collegiate landscape. So when we're thinking about self-advocacy, I know we've done a previous webinar all about self-advocacy, but kind of to give everybody a refresher, is that self-advocacy is a form of communication and includes all sorts of different things. It can be really simple, it can be really complex, but it includes different categories of ideas and concepts, such as speaking up for ourselves, staying informed, knowing our rights, finding support, solving problems, being self-determination, and also asking for help. Essentially, self-advocacy is a great way to promote independence, and in fact does promote independence. So that's something I want us to be mindful of as we think. And when we talk about self-advocacy, I want us to remember that all of us do this on a daily basis. We advocate for ourselves and make decisions from the second we wake up until we go to bed. And also we make decisions, we speak up for ourselves. And we speak up for ourselves, think about the decisions that we're making each day, whether it was what you're wearing or choosing to attend today's webinar, or maybe you advocated that you need more time off for the holidays, that there's all sorts of different things that we're able to do. And what's really important when we talk about self-advocacy is that in college, we're especially learning these skills if we haven't learned them already, because autistic people and young adults especially are expected to be independent. And what makes this really difficult is a lot of us are likely legal adults at this point. Most of us are over the age of 18 and probably do not have a guardianship or other arrangement in place. And there's also concerns with things like FERPA. There's a lot of different reasons that we might not have our parents or caregivers or other grownups or other adults for that matter as involved as we had when we were in high school or different post-secondary program. So learning how to advocate for ourselves becomes really paramount. Think about even when we talk about professors, is I know from teaching, and I do have neurodivergent students in my class and disabled students, their parents aren't the ones who are coming to me if there's an issue in class. They can't. It is not the role of the parent. The people who come to me are the students, unless the student has maybe hired somebody, which is very unlikely in my situation, or it's someone else from the department or someone from disability services who informs me. So there's all sorts of different things when we talk about advocating for ourselves, and there's a lot more reasons why it's expected and something that we should be teaching earlier on, and also making sure that we are equipping college students with the ability to advocate for themselves and be able to get the things that they need when it comes to things like accommodations. And when we're using these self-advocacy skills, think about when we use them, especially as young adults. As they might be using them within our own community, or we might be using them with employers, we might be using them with officials or policymakers, maybe even policymakers and officials at the university level. We might be doing this to receive accommodations. We might be doing it to start student organizations or to get a different effort for inclusion or something else we're passionate about underway. Or we might just be learning from other folks as well. So I know that a lot of campuses that are inclusive now do have more support groups and organizations that are dedicated to the well-being of disabled and autistic students. So since I've been in college, I've seen chapters of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network on college campuses. I've seen disabled students associations. One of the really cool things that happened since I graduated law school was the creation of a National Disability Law Students Association, all sorts of things that have granted community and given us opportunities to learn and support each other as well. And being able to advocate for ourselves is the only reason pretty much that a lot of those groups exist in the first place. I also want to think about how we're doing things when it comes to asking for accommodations, is that we don't have to do everything all by ourselves, that we might be able to lean on our families and caregivers and others for support, but ultimately we might be the ones talking. We might be the ones who are sharing what we need, but we still have that support behind the scenes. And that's kind of because we are adults, like we were talking about, and there are legal reasons as well why someone else might not be able to advocate for you or on your behalf in those places. And something else I want to make sure that we talk about when we do have our discussion about accommodations is we're leveling the playing field. You are not getting an unfair advantage, and asking for help or an accommodation is not a sign of weakness. This is something that I often believed when I was in college, because again, I really wanted that typical college experience no matter how we got there. And I think it's important that students realize that when we do talk about leveling the playing field, we're just making sure that you have access to the same opportunities and that you aren't at an unfair advantage because or disadvantage even because of the way that your brain operates. So if you want to get accommodations, you might need to register or speak to a campus disability resource center or specialist. That person might be able to point you in the right direction. They might be able to help start those conversations with difficult professors. They might be able to start that conversation with housing. They especially helped me with housing because I didn't want to live with someone I didn't know. I was very nervous. They did help me meet my first roommate, and housing and the disability resource centers ended up helping me live on my own as well. So then I ended up getting a single room after my roommate didn't work out. So all sorts of different things that are helpful. And depending on your campus, you might have to register before the semester starts. If this is something that is concerning, especially for our traditional students who are younger, and that might be newly minted 18-year-olds, a great time to start doing this stuff is during orientation when it might be more normalized almost, or seemingly not a big deal to have your parents with you or another caregiver or trusted adult. And then you guys can go there together. That's something that I did. I was 17 at the time, so it was really at my advantage to have my parents because I was not technically an adult. So they were able to help me start registering and to know who I needed to know in disability services, or while I was in orientation activities over the summer, they were the ones who spoke to the disability center. So I would know who was there and what to expect as well. So there's lots of ways to kind of get creative when it comes to accommodation solutions, and that you don't have to do it all yourself either. I also wanted to talk a little bit about IEPs because we talk a lot about accommodations. And often when we talk about IEPs, there's this misguided assumption that an IEP is essentially what accommodations you're going to end up getting, and you're going to have a very similar structure in college. It does not work that way. Colleges do not have to follow the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is what governs public schools and students up until high school graduation or age 21. And that goes by whichever comes first. If you are enrolling at a 2 to 4 year institution or a post-secondary program, you have already graduated from high school, or you are 21 and over. So IDEA does not apply to you. But what it's important to understand with IDEA is that you do get that free and appropriate education in the least restrictive environment. And folks who do have an IEP, which is a collection of documents that details the student's goals and successes and needs, that is not going to be followed by the college immediately. Colleges are bound by the Rehabilitation Act because a lot of them do receive federal dollars. And they also have to follow the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. So what that means is that they are required to provide reasonable accommodations, but they do not have to explicitly follow your IEP from when you were in high school or before. So they might use that information to inform the process to decide what's reasonable based on your individual needs. But your IEP is not essentially gospel in this situation. And I think that's something a lot of folks kind of mess up every once in a while. If you have 504, you might have a different kind of outcome because colleges might have to follow 504 because of federal dollars. So all sorts of different things to be considering, but realize that also, in addition to that transition to college and adulthood, an IEP might not apply, and your needs in college might also be different. So that is okay. Look at an IEP, if you had one beforehand, as almost like a little bit of a roadmap, that there are things on there that might be really relevant. Like maybe you received extra time, but maybe also exams might have been a lot shorter. So you have to think about that as well. Or maybe it doesn't include things for like independent living or whatnot as well, or the dorms. So just remember, this informs the accommodation and accessibility process, not that it is a continuation. That being said, I want to switch gears for our last part of today's talk about college. I want to talk about socializing and social isolation. I know this is a concern of many of us, especially when we are new students, of like, how do we make friends? What do we do? This seems like a lot to take in. So when we're thinking about social isolation, and we saw that earlier when we talked about what autistic people do after high school, we saw that socialization was a huge part of that and being part of our communities. So we're more likely than others to experience social isolation. And that leads to concerns about mental health. So you see a lot of concerns with most college students, let alone autistic students, about anxiety or depression. And as we know, autistic students may already have a co-occurring mental health diagnosis, We also have our adjustment to those transitions and also concerns about social rejection and struggling to meet new people, especially in an unfamiliar environment. So that's kind of our overview of what social isolation kind of is and what we're thinking about there. And at least for me, when it came to that social isolation, I was extremely afraid of that. I wanted the typical college experience, no matter what that meant. I didn't want to be perceived as different in any way, shape, or form. I didn't want my autism to be the defining factor of who I was as an 18-year-old college freshman. I wanted to be as normal, quote unquote, as possible. I wanted to go to football games like you see here. I wanted to have a roommate. I wanted to know people. I wanted to get really involved. I went to every social mixer that they had in my dorm because I wanted to meet everyone. But what I ended up realizing is I also had to be aware of if those things were too much for me, of when to excuse myself if I felt overwhelmed or overloaded or that it was a sensory nightmare. I also tried really hard to get involved on campus and I wanted to join pretty much everything because I was so desperate to make friends and I really wanted to meet people. And I also came from an environment in high school where it was almost seen as necessary to be a high achiever. So it was really important to me to kind of live up to being that high achiever. And what happened is I would start to burn out. I realized I was in over my head socially with things that I didn't always want to be involved in or things that I found extremely overwhelming, that I struggled a lot with my roommate and living alone and living away from home. And also getting involved, I feel like I was overcommitted in addition to, of course, my schoolwork. So we have to also be mindful of our mental health. We have to be mindful of how we're executive functioning and planning these things accordingly. Because I realized if I didn't see school as the top priority, things could have went south in many different directions for me. And I think about how we make friends. And sometimes what I always tell people, whether it's you're a first year student and you're autistic, or you're also neurodivergent or neurotypical, is don't be afraid to say hello. So this is probably one of the best times to try to say hello to new people because you're not the only one who is probably feeling kind of awkward. Most people are nervous and looking to make friends at the beginning of this life transition. So chances are if you say hello to someone, it's not going to be super weird. Most people don't know anybody either. And you might make somebody's day better and you might meet your best friend. You might meet someone interesting. I said hello to somebody in my dorm and asked if they wanted to go to Target because there was an event at Target and I thought it would be fun to go to Target. And the person that I asked to go to Target with me turned out to be one of the closest friends that I've made in my lifetime. Just because I said, hey, do you want to go? Because this person lives nearby because we all lived in the dorms together. And I was like, do you want to go to Target? Because it was the first person who seemed like they weren't really doing anything. So you never really do know what's going to happen just because you maybe put yourself out there, in even though everyone's a little nervous. And it doesn't matter if you're being awkward about it, or maybe you think you're being awkward about it, or you think nobody's going to like you, because at this point in the game, especially early on, everybody's kind of in the same boat. Something else, especially for our neurodivergent crowd, is do join those student organizations and clubs or start one. So what I say about this is you will meet people who have similar interests and passions as you. And that makes it really easy because you get a jumping off point to talk to people about. So they don't have to know your major. They might not know your personal life or where you're from, but you have this interest that ties you all together. But if this is something you were doing, you might end up overwhelming yourself if you're not careful. And I highly advise that you try to stay organized however you can, whether it's with planners or sticky notes or Google calendars or anything to remind you and help you. And also realizing this is not the top priority. It is totally okay if you never meet another soul, but I want to help you avoid social isolation however I can. Something else in that same vein is I always tell folks to volunteer. So the thing about volunteering is that you will meet people that are passionate about the community around you and also some of the same interests that you are. I volunteered to work with autistic children when I was in college because I knew I'd meet people who were probably somewhat understanding of accessibility, and also that I got to hang out with people that I might not have otherwise met in college as well. And finally, the big kicker, if you're really desperate to meet people or get out, or you don't want to be alone in your room, is there are all sorts of free events that happen. And when I was in college, there was an event that happened every Friday night at the Student Union. Everybody acted like they didn't care about it and it wasn't very cool, but secretly they all went every single week. It was always a movie and like a game night or something very kind of low key and relaxing. And a lot of these things do happen because people want to meet people want to be entertained. They don't want to do something that might be dangerous or illegal or anything of that nature. And a lot of the times, a lot of students go because there's free food. And as we know, dining can be expensive and students are budgeting and trying to be mindful of money. So people might go just for the food. And I have had friends who do go to events for nothing, if not just to eat. So if you are someone who knows that there's good catering or you are trying to plan meals, this might be a great way to grab something that you might have wanted, but maybe don't want to spend the money for, don't know where the restaurant is. So whenever I was in college, I'd usually cater a lot from one of the best grocery stores down here. They would cater from all sorts of chain restaurants that otherwise going to dinner would probably be a little bit prohibitive. And something else as well is if check out if those events are accessible. So maybe they might be related to a support group. Maybe they might be in a quiet space. Maybe it might be capped at a certain number of folks. That if it's accessible, it's going to be a lot easier for you to meet people and also to hopefully make some friends. And if you don't make friends, that's okay too. You don't have to do anything that's out of your comfort zone too much or overwhelming. So when I think about that, I usually think about things like fraternities and sororities. That was a little bit too much for me. And I don't regret that or feel that that was an issue, but that is something that might be concerning to some of our young people. And don't feel pressure to do anything that you don't feel comfortable with. You are an individual, and that is a beautiful, wonderful thing. And also, it's okay to set those boundaries, and people will respect that. And if they don't, they're not the right people for you. And I want to talk a little bit about self-identity as well. So when it came to college, college was the first time that I really had that neurodiversity and social justice education. I ended up minoring in disability studies because it was the first time I ever had that knowledge base and that I got to meet people who are that different than where I grew up and what I already knew. So I began to really grow into having an autistic identity. I really grew into knowing who I was and what that meant in a broader context. So whether for a lot of people that might be religious, that might be racial, that might be cultural, there's a lot of different reasons. And when I went to a diversity retreat when I was in college, that was the first time that I was comfortable talking with other students about autism and disability. And we talked about what that meant. And it was a really powerful experience, especially because when we talk about diversity now, even we realize how often disability and neurodiversity and autism get excluded from that conversation. So when I was in college and brought that up, it was pretty groundbreaking, honestly, and pretty much a new frontier and really opened a lot of people's perspectives. And it also opened my perspective on who I was and what my community looked like. And with that, you end up finding your people. So college is that time that people do kind of find themselves, that a lot of people say, but for autistic young people, it can be a wonderful time to understand what their autism means to them and to also have that identity component. I also think that this is a time when a lot of folks might explore their passions, discover new passions. I didn't realize I even wanted to be a lawyer until I was in college because I didn't know that lawyers do a lot of advocacy and speaking and writing. I thought it was all just going to court every day. And I was extremely wrong about that. And also, this might be a time that you find an older or younger student and either become a mentor or a mentee to somebody. So there's so much learning that goes on, whether it's in the professional development space, the personal development, or somewhere in between of just learning how to be an adult while we're in college. So I just thought I'd share some little throwback pictures to one of those first retreats that I went on and what that meant for me as a young autistic person, really feeling like I was part of a group and feeling included in something, and also feeling like I was beginning to find places where I belonged. And I am so grateful that we had this time together to really think about some of the different things that come up during the university times, and also as folks begin to transition to adulthood and beyond. And I'm excited to get to know everyone a little bit better and make some time as well if we have any questions, comments, feelings, or things that we'd like to talk further about.
Great, thank you so much, Hayley. I would like to just put out there that anyone who would like to unmute yourself, you can feel free to raise your hand and I will unmute you if you'd like to ask Hayley any questions verbally. And you can also feel free to post any of those questions in the chat as well. I also we did post from our staff the website in the chat. Brittany posted that for us. And we also posted the link to the slide deck for today's presentation that Hayley provided us if you'd like to reference any of the information in today's presentation. I also will be putting the follow-up survey in the chat for you if you have a couple minutes right now while it's timely and fresh in your brains to go ahead and take the follow-up survey for us. I'll put that in chat right now. And then we did have one question, Hayley. Hi, I am an elementary special education curriculum and instruction specialist. At what point would you recommend talking to students about their disability and including them in the IEP meeting? Should this be the parent's decision?
I have a lot of feelings about this, and this is such a wonderful question, and I'm so glad that you asked it. I personally think that it is the parent's decision to talk about the disability. The child is, of course, central to the IEP. I think that, at least for me, I knew about my autism when I was about 9. And after that, I started getting included with all meetings with the teachers. I think that we have to include students with disabilities in these meetings as well, because we have to understand what their goals are. And it's really strange having a conversation about somebody without knowing what somebody wants. So I think that you can advise the parents that maybe we should be including the student or the young person, and maybe give a couple reasons why and help advocate alongside them. I think this is something that is really kind of nuanced. And of course, it does depend on level of understanding. I think that with parents, they should always be mindful of talking to a child about disability. I think that there's ways to explain it that are age appropriate or possibly developmentally, for that matter, appropriate, depending on what ages and stages of life that somebody is in. How I might explain disability to a 9-year-old is different than how I might explain it to a 17-year-old. And especially if they also have an intellectual disability or other limited understanding, that conversation might look very differently. But I do think that they should absolutely be present at some point, and especially as we get closer to transitioning to adulthood, not just in elementary school. So I did go later on in elementary school, but I don't know if it's always appropriate, or it should be if the parents feel comfortable, say, including a kindergartner. I really do think this is something that is very individual based on each family and each person. So try to be mindful. And I think that you can also maybe suggest, or if you feel comfortable saying that, maybe that it's best that the family does get involved, or that you think that the child's opinion might be valued. And I think that there might be considerations of who belongs in an IEP meeting. And I believe in some places it could be the child that is required to be there as well. So there's lots of things to be thinking about. And I don't want to incorrectly quote what is in the law and what is required of IEPs.
Great, thank you for your response, Hayley. We did have a comment. Thank you for all of these great resources. I really enjoyed hearing from Hayley about her own journey. Well, great. We're glad you enjoyed that, Jessica.
Thank you.
Today. Yep. Anything else? Last call. Hayley, did you have any final
I see that
remarks?
there's a hand up.
Oh, I apologize. Tracy, I will allow you to talk here.
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you so much. I'm like literally driving in the car crying right now. I am a high school special education teacher, but my son has recently been diagnosed on the spectrum, and he's a freshman in high school, and we are on the struggle bus in so many of the things that you talked about today. And it gives me comfort and hope that we are going to figure this out, and he's going to be successful in college. So I just wanted to say thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm gonna allow Brittany to talk now. She raised her hand. Brittany Holm.
I apologize. That was an accident, but thank you very much, Hayley, for your time today.
Thank you.
All right. I don't see any other hands. And I don't see any other questions in the chat or the Q&A. Did you have any final thoughts, Hayley?
I just wanted to thank all of you for being patient with me, for joining us in our conversations and webinars. And also there's another question actually. So before we close out, Tracy asks if there's any suggestions for getting students comfortable with ASD diagnoses. And that's such a great question. So I think it's really important to connect them and have a sense of community, because I think so many students and young people who find out that they're on the spectrum or that they're autistic feel alone. They feel that something is weird or wrong or bad about who they are, and they don't realize that this is just part of human diversity and that they're not essentially a failed version of normal. So I think introducing them to other autistic people, realizing who is out there in the community, I think giving that sense of community is something that's really powerful. And also giving that sense of who might be a role model, and also being affirming in class or in other situations. So we realize that it's not just someone who might feel alienated or alone. And I realize that people have very different identity journeys. Some people might never feel comfortable with it, and others will always feel comfortable sharing, or they might just look at it as this is what it is, or they might look at it as something to be ashamed of. I think no matter where your students feel, I think it's important to understand why they feel the way they do, and then we can kind of work from there to make them feel a sense of identity, a sense of pride, or a sense of empowerment. So we think it's really important to understand where folks are coming from. Maybe it's something in their home life. We have to really be mindful that people have very different reactions. And I realized the fact that I have an extremely supportive family did not make me feel that I was weird or less than or any of that as well. And I think that's such a huge privilege. So I think we have to also really do keep in consideration where people are coming from when we think of why a student might be uncomfortable with a diagnosis. If we have no other questions, comments, feelings, or concerns, I just wanted to thank all of you so much for joining us for this webinar and for allowing me the chance to share my story and to give you a little bit more to think about as we talk about autistic people reaching adulthood and transitioning. If you want to know more about me, I would love to get to stay in touch. Feel free to say hello over email or social media. I'm looking forward to connecting with you. And I know since we are near the end of the year, and probably will be in either late 2021 by the time people are rewatching this, or that are watching live, or that are or if you're catching us at the beginning of the new year, I wish you all a happy new year, and I hope that everything keeps going well, and thank you again.
Thank you so much, Hayley. And I'm going to go ahead and close this out. Happy holidays and happy new year, everyone. Thank you.